All right, first up, Council Bill 261. Councilwoman Gilmore, will you please have 261 put on the floor for final passage?
Thank you, Mr. President. I put Council Bill 261 on the floor for final passage.
It has been moved and seconded. The public hearing for Council Bill 261 is now open. And speakers, you can address either Council Bill 261 or 262 during your allotted time. May we have the staff report?
Thank you, Council President Herndon and members of City Council. Good evening. I am Abe Barge with the City's Community Planning and Development Department. I'm joined by Nathan Batchelder from the Department of Excise and Licenses, who will be joining in the presentation for the second half when we start to talk about the licensing component of the system. So most of you know that the discussion regarding short-term rentals has been going on for quite some time now. Over 2 years ago, Councilwoman Sussman convened the Sharing Economy Task Force, which was later folded into the Neighborhoods and Planning Committee. And both that committee and the task force met many times to discuss short-term rentals. We also had a staff working group throughout this period composed of representatives from multiple departments, including the Mayor's Office, Community Planning and Development, Excise and Licenses, as well as the City Attorney's Office. And we spoke with registered neighborhood organizations throughout the process, including INC and Capitol Hill United Neighbors. Also, this year, the Department of Excise and Licenses hosted 4 town hall meetings in different quadrants of the city that were very well attended. We had quite a few residents and other stakeholders come to talk to us about short-term rentals during those town hall meetings. As you know, this discussion resulted in the current proposals that are before you tonight, which come in 2 pieces. There's the first piece is a proposed change to the zoning code to allow short-term rentals as an accessory use. The second piece is a companion licensing ordinance that will create a business licensing system for short-term rentals. The criteria for adoption of the 2 pieces is a little bit different. So I'll be talking primarily about the zoning code text amendment component, and then I'll turn it over to Nathan Batchelder to talk about the licensing component of the system. The zoning code text amendment component began the legislative process with a planning board hearing in March. And its purpose, the purpose of the text amendment, is to recognize the growing popularity of short-term rentals while still providing protections for neighborhoods, residents, short-term rental guests and hosts, operators of traditional lodging accommodations, that's hotels and bed and breakfasts. It's also intended to support that companion licensing ordinance that I talked about. And the bill, the text amendment, is sponsored by Councilwoman Mary Beth Sussman from District 5. So just to bring us onto the same page about the status of short-term rentals in the city now, they are not allowed in most residential districts. Well, they're not allowed in any districts that are purely residential, and that prohibition is enforced by complaint by Neighborhood Inspection Services at this time. Short-term rentals may be allowed in mixed-use commercial districts, not called short-term rentals. That term doesn't appear anywhere in the zoning code, but as lodging accommodations. So if you're in a district where a hotel is permitted, there is technically the possibility of getting a zone use permit to change the use to lodging accommodations and then getting a business license for lodging accommodations, subject to building code and parking requirements. The proposed text amendment allows short-term rentals as accessory to a primary residential use, and short-term rentals would be permitted as an accessory use with limitations where residential uses are currently allowed throughout the city. And I just want to acknowledge that clearly the demand for short-term rentals varies across the city. If you go on any of the hosting platforms and look at the sites, the short-term rentals on offer are concentrated towards the center of Denver, not surprisingly. However, there are short-term rentals all over the city, just fewer numbers away from the center. And, you know, as we've had this discussion about short-term rentals, I think we haven't really seen why short-term rentals, the potential benefits and impacts would be substantially different from one single-family neighborhood to another single-family neighborhood, say, regardless of whether there are lots of short-term rentals there now or very few short-term rentals there now based on the market. So that's why we're proposing this citywide approach, which is quite consistent with what all of our peer cities have done. No zoning permit would be required to conduct short-term rentals. That's because we've talked to quite a few other cities. Nathan has talked to a lot of cities about their experience with regulation of short-term rentals, and it's very clear that they feel that a streamlined approach is the way to get a higher level of compliance. And so in this proposed approach, we place most requirements for short-term rentals in the business licensing component of the approach. So you're required to get a business license, which is why we decided that a requirement to get a zoning permit would be duplicative. And so I will acknowledge that most other home-based businesses that are permitted now, if you have a home beauty parlor or a home office, are classified as home occupations, which is a category of home-based business, and those do require a zoning permit. However, they don't require a business license. And so we actually are making a lot of the same requirements. We're just doing it on the business license side where we think we can have better enforcement. And so the proposed text amendment would permit short-term rentals that are conducted by the person using the dwelling unit as their primary place of residence, and that could be the owner or the renter living there. And I just want to emphasize that rental of a whole house or dwelling unit is permitted. The resident could be off-site fulfilling National Guard duty, they could be on vacation, and so this isn't necessarily sharing a room with the person that lives there. We would expect that there always will be a number of whole houses available to host short-term rentals while the owners are away. They would be permitted in a primary structure or an attached or detached accessory dwelling unit. However, they could not be, you couldn't have multiple guests at one time on different contracts, unlike a hotel, which rents rooms out to different parties. This would be just one party at a time, whether they were staying in the detached accessory structure or the primary structure. But both of those would be permitted, but only one set of guests. And it also would not include rental for special events such as weddings or parties. And of course, the inverse of the primary resident requirement is that if you don't live there, you would not be able to conduct a short-term rental in the dwelling unit. That requirement, the primary resident requirement, is intended to help preserve the fabric of residential neighborhoods. So in this framework, the primary use remains residential, long-term residential living, with short-term rentals permitted as accessory to that primary residential use. And that recognizes decades of experience that we have in the city of Denver with home-based businesses, and that indicates that there are fewer concerns when there's a primary resident present. Denver's current regulations allow those home occupations, home-based businesses, as I mentioned before, and those are businesses that are conducted by the person that lives there. That beauty salon is a beauty salon that you as the resident are running. You're not renting out your house to be a beauty salon that somebody else is running. And this approach, this primary resident approach, also allows us to continue evaluation of potential impacts on housing stock. There are a lot of questions, what does this mean for affordability in the change of units from long-term rentals, say, to short-term rental? And we don't know for sure, and some of the studies that have been done in other cities are not completely conclusive. But with this approach, we're taking a first step towards regulation of short-term rentals that leaves future options open. If we opened everything up now and then tried to go back, that would be more difficult, I think, than taking a cautious approach now and then revisiting through the advisory committee that Nathan will tell you about whether additional flexibility is appropriate in some areas. We've received a lot of public comment through letters and emails, as well as at those town hall meetings. I'll just summarize a little bit of what we've heard this is through 3 o'clock today. So we've received 224 letters and emails, and of those 224 letters, about 32% specifically mentioned something about supporting that primary resident requirement. About 46% specifically mentioned opposition to that primary resident requirement. And then nearly half of the emails and letters that we've received have expressed some sort of support for short-term rentals in general as well, saying that they offer benefits to residents and to neighborhoods potentially. However, about 20% have expressed opposition to short-term rentals in general. And those numbers that have asterisks next to them, that's just indicating that in some cases we received a bunch of emails that were kind of on a forwarded email template in those categories. And the position statements that we've received from registered neighborhood organizations and other organizations were included in those numbers I showed you on the previous slide. But just to dial in a little bit more to what we've heard from them, nearly all of them have expressed support for the text amendment as drafted. And those letters that we've received from organizations that didn't specifically say we support the text amendment as drafted, they said we support the primary resident requirement specifically. There is one letter we received from an organization, the Vacation Rental Managers Association, that does express opposition to the primary resident requirement and support for short-term rentals in general. And there were a few RNOs, the Pinehurst HOA, University Park, and West Wash Park. They do say that they really have concerns about short-term rentals and aren't sure whether they should be allowed, but indicate that if they are going to be allowed, it's very important that that primary resident component be left in the requirements. So I'll tell you about the review criteria for the text amendment, and that is consistency with adopted plans, uniformity of district regulations, and we need to find that the text amendment furthers the public health, safety, and welfare of the city. Looking at that first category, there are 2 citywide adopted plans that are applicable here. The first is Comprehensive Plan 2000. It talks about a city of neighborhoods, and that includes modifying land use regulations for flexibility to accommodate changing demographics and lifestyles. So Comprehensive Plan 2000 does anticipate that we will need to look at the zoning code and make revisions to accommodate changing trends and lifestyles. It also talks about allowing or encouraging a diverse mix of things, including home-based businesses. And it talks about promoting a zoning ordinance that's flexible and accommodating of current and future land use needs, such as home-based businesses and accessory flats. And it talks about preserving and modernizing Denver's existing housing stock and established neighborhoods, as well as making an economic objective that we should promote quality accommodations for visitors. So staff feels that the proposed text amendment is consistent with the objectives of Comprehensive Plan 2000. Blueprint Denver talks about maintaining the character of areas of stability while accommodating some level of redevelopment, and it talks about new and revitalized neighborhood centers, which is something that's been part of the discussion, how short-term rental guests may contribute to the vitality of neighborhood centers by shopping and entertaining themselves locally. It makes recommendations that zoning concentrate more on building design than on use. And it specifically says that unenforceable standards should not be included in zoning. And that's something that's really been on our minds throughout the process. Let's not include requirements that we really don't think we can enforce. So staff feels that the proposed text amendment is consistent with Blueprint Denver goals and recommendations. We also find that the proposed text amendment includes reasonable neighborhood protections that will further the public health, safety, and welfare, and that it applies uniformly to all zone districts where residential uses are permitted, which promotes uniformity of district regulations. Planning Board on March 16 voted 7-2 to recommend approval of the text amendment before you tonight, finding that all applicable review criteria have been met. I'll note that the two no votes from Planning Board both express support for short-term rentals in general. One of the no votes sought more flexibility for non-primary resident rentals. The other no vote, they expressed interest in having a more nuanced or geography-based approach that treated some parts of the city differently than others. So, consistent with Planning Board's recommendation, staff recommends that Denver Zoning Code Text Amendment number 8 be approved, finding that the applicable review criteria have been met. So I'll now turn it over to Nathan Batchelder to tell you about the licensing component.
Good evening, Council President and members of Council. Nathan Batchelder, Legislative Analyst with Excise and Licenses. And I'm here tonight to walk you through the very basic proposals of the short-term rental business license. So when we look at the general short-term rental licensing requirements, first, the licensee has to be a legal resident of the United States. That's applicable to all of our licenses. If the licensee is not a property owner, the licensee must have the permission from the landlord or the property owner to operate the short-term rental. The short-term rental unit must be the licensee's primary residence, or what we're referring to in ordinance as that place of normal return. And that can be demonstrated via the proof of voter's registration, driver's license, tax document, utility bills, or any other relevant documentation that's determined sufficient by the Director of Excise and Licenses. The short-term rental has to be located in a zone district that allows residential use, and the licensee must possess a valid Denver lodger's tax and any other applicable tax account numbers, including occupational privilege tax. If we go to the additional licensing rules and regulations, the licensee has to provide the unit address and personal contact information to the department when they apply. Also, the licensee has to provide what we're calling a guest rental packet with all the applicable city rules and regulations that pertain to the safety information to the guest upon each booking. So that can include rules and restrictions regarding on-street parking, all the city applicable noise regulations, trash collection schedule, etc. It'll also include the unit safety information, including the egress and the ingress routes, any fire evacuations, or any other safety features. We'll also require the licensee to have a local emergency contact information in those cases of emergencies. The licensee has to maintain general liability insurance to protect against property damage and bodily injury. The licensee will have to maintain an operable smoke detector, carbon monoxide detector, and fire extinguisher in the unit at all times. And importantly, the licensee has to list the unit's short-term rental license number on any online, print, or other advertisements. And what's exciting about this proposal is that as we watch and monitor other municipalities adopting regulations, we actually see that Denver might be the first in the nation to offer an online short-term rental license. And as Abe mentioned before, making sure we have that easy, streamlined application process is paramount to us so that we can gain as high rate of a compliance as possible. Right here is just the basic steps where people will certify under penalty of perjury online that they meet the requirements. Once they do certify that they meet the requirements, put in their tax license ID number and pay the $25 application fee. Their license, as well as their corresponding license number, will be sent to them essentially, where they can print that license out and then have their license number to start advertising their unit. And when we talk about the short-term rental enforcement, it's important to understand the current enforcement of short-term rentals as it exists in the current zoning code. So the current zoning code has oftentimes been typically burdensome and onerous for neighborhood inspection services inspectors to actually demonstrate or prove that someone is operating a short-term rental license. With the corresponding text amendment, we'll still have regulations and rules that NIS inspectors will still be able to enforce, but we're adding an additional level of business licensing requirements. And these business licensing requirements will be enforced by the new short-term rental division within excise and licenses, which is a dedicated team of inspectors within our department that will have both a complaint-based enforcement operation and also be proactive with compliance monitoring among the licensees. So you can see here our various enforcement tools under the business licensing rule is something that we're used to. Any short-term rental licensee or any responsible party can be subject to these various licensing tools for compliance and suspension and show cause hearings. For example, we could issue a simple notice to comply for operating without a license. We can issue a license suspension for not having a rental packet or having insurance. We can have a general violation or essentially a fine for up to $999 per incident of advertising without a license number. And we can also trigger show cause hearings for that license revocation if we determine that you violated that primary residency requirement. So we feel that in addition to the zoning code regulations that are being adjusted and modified for short-term rentals, we'll have this new layer of business licensing standards that licensees will now have to live up to once they're licensed with the department. And continue with our short-term rental enforcement, we really envision the short-term rental division partnering with our other city agencies to not only enforce the requirements of the ordinance, but make sure that the short-term rental division is aware of any sort of common neighborhood complaints that might come from short-term rentals. So for example, the short-term rental division, which lives out of excise and licenses, we can receive the complaints and investigate about licensed and unlicensed short-term rentals. We can monitor and track advertisements for licensed and unlicensed short-term rentals and make sure that someone's license number is in their advertisement. We can inspect and investigate any other violations of the requirements, including insurance, rental packets, safety features, et cetera. And then our department will be able to issue those general violations, suspensions, and show cause hearings on the actual license itself. And we envision partnering with our city agencies, including DPD, Neighborhood Inspection Services, 311, and Environmental Health. So what we'll be able to do is track what we're calling the common complaints that come in on not only just short-term rental properties, but all of the licensees in our system as well. So we'll be able to know if there was a disturbing the peace call on a particular licensee, any complaints about trash or violating really any sort of local ordinance. Excise and licenses will then be able to take action on that license. What's also great about our proposal here is that we're proposing a 6-month soft enforcement window. And the reason behind this is that we want to make sure people are aware of our short-term rental license and what it means to come in, where they need to get licensed, through which department. And this is really to encourage as high rate of a compliance and educate the host as much as possible on what they need to do to become a responsible host. Some of our soft enforcement tools are really intended to educate hosts about our new rules and requirements. We can send reminder notices to hosts and property owners throughout this 6-month period to make sure they're aware of our licensing requirements and where they can come in and get licensed. We're also anticipating what we're calling now the Host with the Most marketing and education campaign, where a separate marketing and advertising launch will come from excise and licenses to encourage hosts to get licenses and show them where they can get their licenses. We'll also use the Short-Term Rental Advisory Committee and the Short-Term Rental Email Distribution List and other resources we have available to make sure that we spread the word and make sure people get licensed. After the December 31st, 2006 date is when that strict enforcement of the short-term rental ordinance would begin. And finally, we've talked a little bit about the proposed short-term rental advisory committee. And the reason for this advisory committee is to know that we want to make sure this license continues to get honed and sharpened and make sure we have the appropriate tools going forward. So we can actually work with the neighbors and with our community partners to research, study, and do analysis of the local short-term rental industry. We can have this dialogue where we analyze our complaints and the violations and the enforcement efforts and the coordination between the separate departments. And the short-term rental advisory can also provide recommendations and reports to excise and licenses. And one of the things that we found during our town halls is that there was a lot of sentiment and concern about having a non-primary residency option. And I think we understand that, and we recognize those concerns. And what we'd like to do is use this short-term rental advisory committee to really study the feasibility of what that non-primary residency option would be and bring that recommendation back to City Council, but have it go through the same community dialogue, the same community process that this particular proposal went through. Finally, the short-term rental advisory committee can recommend further rules, regulations, and other procedures that can be promulgated by the department, including fine schedules, enforcement procedures, and sort of those other administrative operations outside of the ordinance. The committee can meet as long as necessary and work in perpetuity as long as a license exists. And in terms of that composition of the short-term rental advisory committee, we really have a more the merrier philosophy. We want to have a wide range of views and provide a really robust, objective policy discussions within that advisory committee. So potential members can include neighborhood and R&O representatives, INC representatives, short-term rental licensees and hosts, short-term rental guests, short-term rental industry representatives, hospitality representatives, partnering city agencies, excise and licenses, city council members and their staff, and then outside experts, economists, academics, real estate experts, and housing experts. So with that, we'll conclude our presentation.
Thank you, Abe.